So absolutely delighted to welcome our next guest to take us through this. The Head of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs, the Principal Toxicologist of Human Health at the Cobalt Institute. Brilliant that she's here to take us through this. Please welcome Dr. Vanessa Viegas. Vanessa, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for attending my whirlwind tour of chemicals management. So if we get to the first slides. All right, so as Sasha said, we're looking at the impact of chemicals management on your value chains. And because it's a Cobalt Congress, we're going to look at cobalt today. As you all know and have heard over the last few days, cobalt is a very versatile metal. It has a very wide-reaching value chain. Now, this is just a small screenshot of our Cobalt Institute members, and they represent all parts of this value chain, from the very top, from the manufacturers, down to the end-stream users. And, we all work together here to make sure that cobalt can be used for a long time coming. The cobalt value chain itself is diverse, it's widespread. It consists of the mining at the very top, all the way down to the end uses. And now these figures are actually in our very informative market report from the past few years. We have a wonderful flow diagram, and we have the percentages of cobalt used in the uses today, which we know are majorly in batteries, so electric vehicles and portables, but also very importantly in the superalloys, in the hard metals, and things that are more downstream, such as the catalysts. I'd just like to say now that cobalt is essential in its uses. Otherwise, it wouldn't be used today. It would have been substituted out years ago. But it's critical to enable the technology that we use today. In coming to chemicals management, it's really needed at every stage of this chain. So if you think about the top of it, if you think about extraction and processing, you're looking at chemicals management there in terms of how much is released in the air? Can that prevent me from receiving an emissions permit? And then you're looking a little bit more downstream at the real chemicals management in the workplace in terms of the refining and the chemical processes that go into making these substances. And now I'll go into it a little bit later on in my talk, but what's needed here for chemicals management is a really proactive and a risk-based approach to enable the chain to operate fully. Now, I want to take an example here of the European Union's value chain that we've done recently at Cobalt Institute, and just to see the scale of the impact if you get chemicals management wrong. Now, we cover around 30 substances and 30 end uses, major uses of cobalt. That impacts around 7,000 companies, over 700,000 workers, and that equates to around 200,000 tons of cobalt per year in the EU being used and made, and around a 7.6 billion industry. Now, what we want to see, as I've said before, is a risk-based approach to chemicals management. And now what does that mean? It means you're looking at the likelihood of something happening. So you really need to measure the exposure to the air, to the environment, so that you have a good idea of what's happening and what could happen. Now, this can incorporate the essential nature of cobalt, which I'll go into, and you can also use the information on safe handling and use that we've seen decades in our industry. And I have to say here, a risk-based approach is really the best way to incorporate your scientific information. It's the most pragmatic way to get your chemicals management systems in place. Now that I've said that, we're going to go on to metals in general and why they require a unique approach to chemicals management versus organic substances. So metals are special. I'm not just saying that because I work at Cobalt Institute. They naturally occur. They're everywhere. As was said yesterday in the talks, they're found in the Earth's crust. They're all around us. And as such, living things, human beings, everything, all other organisms, they adapt to metals in their environment. Now, metals are essential in terms of life. They enable life. They enable growth, and I'll go into it with cobalt a little bit later. And they interact with other substances we need to be aware of for chemicals management purposes. So why is cobalt essential for life? Cobalt is essential for the health of humans, of ourselves, in terms of red blood cell production, healthy neurological activity, and it's essential for plants and animals in the form of vitamin B12, which meaning we have cobalt in our bodies right now, and that means that cobalt can never be zero. So it can't ever be at a zero level in your body. So not Jean-Claude Van Damme, but another famous philosopher once said, all substances are poisons. There's none that's not a poison. It's the dose that makes the difference. So you can have too much of a good thing. Cobalt, being an essential element, has a safe range for use and is essential for survival. If you get too low for cobalt, if you get too much of a low concentration, you're going to have a deficiency and ill health. The same can be said if you have too much of a high concentration of cobalt, you will also have ill health. So that we really need to put something in place here to regulate that. Now, I don't want to talk about chemicals management alone. I know that's the title of this talk, but chemicals management needs to be integrated into a holistic approach with sustainability, for example, with responsible sourcing, with government and public affairs. So we're going to look at the global context of cobalt here using one of my favorite examples. There was recently a recommendation for a very low level for cobalt in workplace air of 1, when we saw that the scientific and the socioeconomic information supports a value of 20. And that's the most common value in the world. You have countries that are 20 or above, and then you have a very low value of 1. So 20 really signifies a risk-based approach to cobalt, really looking at, could this hazard occur not at these exposure levels? In terms of what the impact is globally, you will have a disproportionate impact on the countries that have such low values compared to the rest of the world. And you can have huge impacts on manufacturing, use, and recycling of cobalt, which is very important. The disproportionate values can also, unfortunately, drive substitution of cobalt in the workplace. I said it's very difficult to substitute cobalt, but this provides some kind of impetus to do so. And it makes it fairly impossible at one to meet economic and environmental ambitions. Cobalt is a priority. You've heard at the last session and the sessions yesterday, and you will hear at Tom Fairley's upcoming session. Cobalt is a critical raw material, and we know the demand for this is going to increase, not just in the upcoming years, but in the decades to come. And cobalt is also a strategic raw material. We need this for defense. We need this for aerospace. And lastly, in a very positive way of thinking, that cobalt is a key mineral for decarbonization and energy transition. So just to take it back now to the world of chemicals management and what we're dealing with cobalt, it's still an evolving situation. We still have time to influence many regulations around the world. Some are already in place, and this is where the Cobalt Institute comes in to help with all the data we've generated and the information we have and the context we have. I want to use a specific example again of the European Union. Their system is a bit more conservative, let's just say, than pragmatic. We're going to look at the EU batteries regulation shortly. I know that we look at it in terms of sustainability, but chemicals management manages to creep in here in terms of that there's a little bit of caveat there on let's try to restrict substances or provide other risk management of substances of very high concern, as they're called in batteries. Now, this is a hazard label. However, some cobalt substances do have this label and are, in fact, used safely in the workplace. They're safe for use, safe for handling, because we have the right risk management systems. We have a risk-based approach in place. So, if anything to take away, it's these 4 messages here. Chemicals management needs to be pragmatic. We have to protect people and the environment firstly. However, we also need industry to operate. Otherwise, these people won't have jobs, they won't have a livelihood. Cobalt, in very green terms, can contribute to a greener, more circular and sustainable world. As I said before, cobalt is a critical and strategic mineral, and it enables countries to reach their political objectives. And Cobalt Institute, you've seen my colleagues present today and coming up, really has the global knowledge center for cobalt. And in terms of science and technical expertise, is at the top. So thank you again. It was a very whirlwind tour through chemicals management. Didn't want to get into the details, but I think we have time now to take any questions if you have some. Thank you very much.
Vanessa, you and I work together very closely, and what impresses me particularly about the work that you do is that it provides us with the foundation on which we can base all of our policies. And I try and explain this to whenever I talk to stakeholders, but you do it better. So can you please just draw that link between what you do and what we are able to say as an institute?
Thanks so much, Dinah. So as I said, chemicals management can't operate independently. We really, for example, rely on government and public affairs to come in at the very high top political level to ensure that policies aren't put into place that would inhibit industry, that could have a more pragmatic approach to chemicals management. So I work very closely with our government and public affairs colleagues sitting in the front row here if you have any questions for them. For example, for the occupational exposure limit values, and they provide a more real-life example of how we need these to operate in our workplaces. We need the industry to stay in, for example, in the countries that they're in.
Yep, let's get that microphone to you. Just talking about the exposure, you
Yes.
had the most amazing slide towards the beginning of all the different countries with their values. And right down the bottom was the UK with 100 and then Latvia with 500. Am I asking a really naive question, but why? What's going on there?
So there is quite a lot of science that goes into those values. Sometimes there's socioeconomic aspects put on top of it, but it's mainly the science driving it. So, well, the variation in values have to do with how comfortable everyone is with risk. Different countries are uncomfortable with a lot of risk. And if it's working in that country or if they have very little cobalt, they may not review those values over several years. We know they have dropped over the years based on, industrial experience, and we still believe that 20 is it is a very low value, but it enables industry to operate.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's all about the data that you collect, isn't it, and how you do the data. Question.
Hi, Anne-Marie from Glencore. Actually, I had a related question. I think many industry associations were formed exactly because of the chemicals management agenda. So very low risk tolerance and conservative approaches were meant that, through policy, we were inadvertently designing out the ability to work with certain commodities. So I wanted to ask a little bit more about the contribution to data and the research that you do through the Cobalt Institute, because as I said, this is why originally industry said, company X cannot fund a credible study on why the cobalt occupational exposure limit should be this versus this. And we have to come together to fund these studies. Can you tell us a little bit more about the scale of the studies and the types of studies and the data and the time frames?
Sure. Thanks, Anne-Marie, for your question. So as Anne-Marie has said, industry has come together. So you have all players in industry coming together, for example, in the EU under REACH, even competitors, because we're all here for that, the last goal there is to keep industry operating. So very small companies, very large companies have come in to fund studies that are millions of pounds at this point in time. The cobalt industry is looking at exactly how we can defend our scientific and knowledge base here. So we're doing very important studies to look at really fundamental questions about cobalt and cobalt compounds. One of which is, safe levels. What is the safe level for cancer, for example? The cobalt industry is funding this because there are questions around the world, from the EPA right through down to ECHA and to ACIS in Australia. And we're funding that at, several millions of pounds, which we couldn't have been able to do if the companies didn't come together. And that benefits everyone across even the stakeholder chain, so companies, government, and other downstream users. In terms of how we collaborate, it's very important as well that our companies obviously don't just make cobalt or produce cobalt. They have the other metals there too. So we operate in a multi-metallic capacity where we're working very closely with nickel, for example, who is helping fund that oral carcinogenicity study, or zinc, which is also essential to come in on questions that are of very high concern for everybody.
Vanessa, so interesting. Thank you so much for taking us through that. And do you know what strikes me is, just as we're talking about the climate for investment and how investors have to look at all the different risk factors, and you have to change and be nimble and flexible to get that. It's exactly the same thing for industry when you look at chemicals management, that when regulations change, they have to be ready to be nimble as well.
Exactly. Thanks so much for summing that up, Sasha.
Say again, sorry?
Thanks so much for summing that up. That's actually...
No, I mean, it's just been fascinating just to hear that it's a whole other area that also runs alongside everything as well. Vanessa Viegas, thank you very much. Thank you.